from Mark 12, starting in verse 28. One of the scribes came near and heard the Pharisees, who were the priests, the religious establishment, heard the Pharisees disputing with Jesus. And seeing, by the way, that was the only people that Jesus ever got into arguments with. The religious leaders who thought they had it all figured out and could tell everybody else what was right and what was wrong. Those were the only ones Jesus clashed with. A scribe heard Jesus and the Pharisees and asked Jesus, which is the greatest commandment of all? And Jesus said, the first is, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. And then the scribe said to Jesus, you're right, teacher. You have said truly that God is one. And besides God, there is no other. And to love God with all the heart and with all the understanding and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself, this is much more important than all burnt offerings and religious sacrifices. And when Jesus heard that he answered wisely, Jesus said to him, you're not far from the kingdom. And after that, no one dared to ask him any questions. All right, so, I usually try to come up with a joke to begin my sermon. Now, I don't want you to be dependent on that or expect it, I almost, passive aggressively didn't give you one today because you're getting too used to it. Too much pressure on me, but I found one. There was a guy talking to God, and he said, God, is it true that one day is as a billion years with you? And God said, yes. And the guy said, well, is it true that one penny is as $1 billion with you? And God said, yes. And the guy said, hey, God, can I have a penny? And God said, wait a second. All right, so there's three main questions. Who is God? How do we know? And what does it mean to believe? As I was reflecting on this, I realized that one of the reasons why so many of us have a hard time believing in God at all is because of the ideas and the institutions and often the families that we were born into. I've often said, after hearing about the negative, guilt-inducing, unloving, and just plain boring and lifeless experiences so many people have had with church growing up, that I consider myself often to be blessed that I did not grow up going to church. I didn't have any bad experience I had to recover from in order to give this all a more adult or mature listening. And as I've listened to some of what people have gone through, it's staggering how toxic, all that guilt stuff and manipulative stuff can be. I also need to say that some of you had beautiful experiences growing up in the church. And it's not an accident that some of you were the ones who founded this church and who have been here week after week, year after year, your whole life. Something beautiful and life-giving happened early on, and you have stayed with that. And that's what we want for our kids growing up here, or for anybody who shows up here, an experience that's worth building on and sustaining. But there's another thing that most of us need to work our way through before we can, as the scholar Marcus Borg once put it, meet God again for the first time. And that is that we need to understand that a lot of the ideas about God and about the church and about what the Bible says that we have historically inherited may not be, and I would suggest often simply are not true. They're not true to the essence of the overall story of the biblical God, which is about love. Some of these ideas that simply aren't true get so deeply into us, though, that it's almost impossible to get past them. the whole notion or the whole way of notion of a divine source or being or higher power or greater mystery or creator, whatever you want to call it, the whole way we were taught to think about it was influenced by philosophers and theologians and cultures and often empires and political agendas that had nothing to do with the gospel. So I cut anybody who has a hard time with this God thing in this culture a lot of slack, because people have a lot of good reasons to have been completely turned off to what was presented as being God. And some are just ideas that you just can't get out of your head. I mean, like, a lot of us can't get beyond, we start thinking, who is God? You know, you don't raise your hand, but I'll bet at least for a bunch of you, you can't get that image of an old man in the sky with a beard, out of your head. That guy dies hard. Not that he has to, but at best it would be a tiny little glimpse of who God is. Some of us can't get rid of the image of a God who's making a list and checking it twice. And I'm totally convinced that most people's image of God is way closer to Santa Claus than Jesus. Gonna find out who's naughty or nice, who is and is not going to get the existential presence or blessings. This stuff is deep in there. And a lot of us can't get past words like omniscient or omnipresent. Those ideas, those words are not in the Bible anywhere, by the way. They're Greek ideas. They came to us when Greek philosophers dominated the evolution of the church. So the attempt to try to define God with fixed attributes and concepts that we can understand in our minds and evaluate and judge and rely upon or push back on or keep at a safe distance because we don't like them or somehow control is something that happened in church history when those in charge were dominated by Western Greek philosophical concepts that weren't part of the Jewish Hebrew experience at all. You with me? I won't stay too intellectual, don't worry. One of the foundational stories in the Bible is the story of Moses when he's on the run after having killed someone. And he's on the run. And he, in the wilderness, encounters the burning bush. And God speaks to him out of the bush. Most of you have heard the story, right? And tells him to go back where he was running from and to actually go to the Pharaoh, to the king, to the monarch, the despot, and to tell him to let the people go from slavery. And as you can imagine, Moses was not thrilled with the assignment. And he finally says, okay, who should I tell him sent me? And that's when God says, Yahweh, which simply means I am. Or it could be translated, I will be who I will be. And I can imagine Moses thinking, you're not helping me out much here. But the Hebrews from the outset understood that you were not going to fit God into some nice, tidy little concepts. And they had so much respect for the mystery. That would be another way of saying who Yahweh is. It would be like God saying, okay, here's my name, mystery. Which is another way of saying, here's my name, unanswered questions. That's who I am. You're never going to figure this all out. And I love the fact that the Jewish people had enough respect for the mystery that they said, let's not even say the name. They would not say, they made it a prohibition to speak the name Yahweh out loud, because they said, if we use that name, we're going to think that's who God is, and we're going to start arguing about it. And every name is a limited concept at best. So who is God? Well, the bulk of the rest of my message today is going to be an excerpt of a conversation between two people from whom I have a lot of respect. Their names are Bryan McFarland. Some of you have heard me talk about Bryan. He's a dear friend of mine, a brilliant historical figure at this point in the world. And another guy named Tripp Fuller, who's an up-and-coming popular theologian. His work is done mostly through podcasts, and he has a regular listenership of over 30,000 people to his podcast. And Tripp and Bryan and another woman who's a well-known theologian these days named Diana Butler Bass did a series of presentations where they, for six different presentations, they said, who is God to us now, 20 years after 9/11? In this world, what are we dealing with? So I listened to all of them, and I have to thank Trish Calhagen for sending it to me, sending me the link. But then after it was all done, Tripp started getting all kinds of questions from people who listened to the podcast. And so Tripp asked Bryan to do just a one-to-one Zoom meeting that they recorded to have conversation in response to some of the questions. So here's the first question. A woman named Rachel wrote and said this: what I really need to know is, who is God? I mean, I feel like there's an answer or an encounter or something that I get at when I use that word, but I don't know where to begin speaking when I try to speak about God. How do I differentiate the past content of that word and all its baggage that has been so troublesome and toxic from something that's worth talking about? And here's Bryan McFarland's response. He said, well, first, Rachel, I'd just like to give a reaction to the question, and then I'd like to hear your reaction to the question, Tripp, before we even try to answer it. Because my reaction to the question, Rachel, is that this is the question to raise. Because what's so disturbing and harmful about current ideas of God is the way they've been twisted and become part of an ecosystem of suicide for our species and genocide for our species. So that question needs to be asked. But here's the thing. I think it needs to be asked in a way that you aren't expecting an answer that's as simple and definitive as most of the existing answers. In other words, right now, we have existing answers like God is omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent being who rules and controls the world, and in some traditions, who created the world so that human beings could be sorted out into those who will experience eternal conscious torment and those who will experience eternal conscious bliss. That's a very clear definition. And if you want something clear, I think you're in trouble. And I'm not going to be able to help you. Because this is Bryan speaking, I've actually stopped looking for a precise answer. In other words, the need for clarity itself could be the thing that is actually most in the way. And maybe the thing with God is that we're supposed to live the question with a spirit of humility and gratitude and joy. Because even asking the question with an open heart and mind means that you do have a sense that there might be some kind of current to the universe that's pulling us toward love. And so you learn to live that question with humility and joy. And I think you get to a better place with the question that way. That's my response. What do you think, Tripp? And here's what Tripp said. Yeah, I think that question, who is God, is an important one to linger on. I really like how Rachel said, I feel there's an answer or an encounter. She actually wrote answer/encounter. Because the encounter is kind of an answer in itself. I mean, Bryan, you and I met 16 years ago for the first time. And if somebody asked me then who Bryan McFarland was, I'd say it was the guy who came up with this idea of the emergent church thing. And somebody told me I might like you and what you had to say. So I went to an event you were speaking at. But over 16 years, we've gotten to know each other. We've met each other's families. We spent time together. We've worked on projects together. We have a bunch of mutual friends together. So, part of the understanding of a person or another being is that there's this encounter. But if they're a genuine being, then just because you encounter them, not only does it not mean you don't know everything about them, it means you deliberately keep open the question in order to honor the mystery of who somebody is, and so that you love that person and not just an idea about them. There's a lot more. I'm going to distill it. He quotes this theologian named Alfred Whitehead, who says a lot of the same stuff, the conversation about who is God, concepts, being like a ruler, like a king or something. He says, there's another option. And this is the one the gospel tells us. God is a homeless Jew in first century Palestine who lived among us in a certain way and showed us what love looks like by embodying the energy and the presence of love and God as a human being. And so Bryan and Tripp went on to say, we need to stop trying to figure out a definition and instead focus on the presence of the love that is in people who are open to the divine. Maybe God is the love that fills your life and your heart and your relationships. And that's not radical. The Bible says God is love. So they went on to say, maybe we should reframe the question. Instead of saying, who is God? Ask ourselves, where do we experience love? And what is love doing in our lives when we open ourselves up to it completely? That's the energy and the essence of God. The second part, how do you know? I'm not going to say much about that, except this. You know the presence of love when it has truly come into your being. As most of you know, I didn't grow up going to church. I had a spiritual awakening when I was 17. And all that happened was this. I met a young woman who was so full of love that I had to ask her, why are you the way you are? And I saw she's got something that I am deep down hungry and thirsty for. What is that? And then she just refused to take the credit for it and pointed me toward the source of it as she understood it. And she said, it's God. She said, try reading the Bible yourself. She said, try starting with the New Testament, the Gospels. So I read in Matthew. I got to the 5th chapter where Jesus said, you heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, love your enemies. Do good to people who have hurt you, and you'll be like God. And I remember thinking, I've told this story before, you'll hear it again. That's true. Because I was in a prison of resentment and anger and bitterness toward my dad, toward some friends. And when I said, okay, God, if you're really there, would you please do something about that? And this is where, how do you know when you give up trying to prove it to anybody? And you know by the evidence in your own life, and maybe if you're blessed in the lives of some people you get to watch closely, and you see what love does and how deep down it changes people when you're open to it and you give up trying to argue with it and be in a debate with it and just say, oh my God, what's happening to me? And it's not one joy ride into it. You'll get there, you'll have a breakthrough, you'll lose it, you'll wonder where it went, you'll find it again. That's the nature of the journey. And what does it mean to believe? It means to give yourself to that. To trust your whole life to that presence and agenda of love. Not just mental, intellectual assent to a set of propositions. Saying, I am putting all my eggs in the basket of love. That's what my life's going to be about. I'm going to seek the source of that and keep opening myself up to it. All right. I had lots more. I didn't get to it as usual. I'm going to close, though, with this. The beauty of what I'm trying to say, if I made the point, is that it's so darn simple. I don't know anyone who is not smart enough to get this. I do know some people who think they are too smart to be open to it. My daughter, Emma, half of you know this story. When she was 2 years old, I was giving her a bath. And she said to me, she said, Daddy, where is love? Where is God? She's always been a deep kid. She was almost 3. And I said, well, God's everywhere. And I could tell that didn't help her at all. And so I said, well, the Bible says that God is love. So wherever you know there's love, God is there. And it's a true story. She's playing with her toys. And all of a sudden she said, oh, Daddy, God's in me. And I said, how do you know? She said, because I love you, Daddy. On 3, we say, aw. Ready, 1, 2, 3? That's it. How do you know? That's how. Don't look for a well-defined being out there. Look for the presence of who and what that being is about when it's in here and among here. And if that doesn't help, well, that's all I got.